Welcome to Danny's Podcast.
This is the Redefining Plastics Podcast. Welcome to the Redefining Plastics Podcast. One of the most prevalent comments that I receive is, I don't understand half the stuff you're saying. So I think what I'm going to dig into today, demystifying the plastics industry and trying to make it easier for people to understand what we're talking about by just going through some of the acronyms that are used and trying to make it simpler for people to understand what we're talking about. So I'm going to go through some of the more common acronyms that we use in the industry and try to break them down simply and to make it easier for people that are following along so they understand what we're talking about as an industry and trying to make this a little more approachable. So hopefully as we go through all of this, it makes it a little simpler, makes it a little easier for people to understand. One of the key sources of confusion, it's just plastics in general. There are so many different types. Each does something different. Why do we need so many? And it's complicated. When you break it down, each of these materials are engineered for a specific purpose. They are ideally suited for the applications that they have been engineered for. And so that has made it so we've got multiple different types of polymers. And each of those polymers make it difficult to recycle, which we'll get into later in this discussion. But what we'll do here is we'll break down each of the polymer types. We'll talk about different policy levers that are out there. We'll talk about just jargon and different things as we break it down. The following list is going to be in no way exhaustive. We're just going to talk about some of the major polymers that are used and what they're used for on a high level, some of the acronyms that are used to describe these polymers, and then hopefully that will start to clear up some of the confusion as I'm walking through and talking to other plastics professionals, and I use these phrases and terms just interchangeably, and hopefully that'll serve as a primer for people so they can understand what we're talking about. First up is PET. It's widely known to most people, but most people don't know what PET stands for. So polyethylene terephthalate. I always struggle with that last part, so I'm happy I didn't butcher it the first time. But this material, think water bottles, think clamshells. And when I say clamshells, like when you buy a salad at a grocery store and it's clear and you can see through there. Window films that can be in baguette bags. So if you see a paper bag and there's a window in it, most of the time that's going to be a PET film. This material is made from a couple other acronyms. So PTA, so terephthalic acid, and MEG, monoethylene glycol. Those two things are put together. They are put through a reactor. You get PET. PET is clear. You got multiple different types of PET. You've got a crystalline PET, which is going to give it a little more structure and rigidity and allow it to take some additional heat. Then you've got APET, so amorphous PET, which is the typical PET that you're going to see. And that's going to be clear and think water bottles, things like that. You also have PETG, which is going to go into medical applications. So there's a lot of different types. It's more than just water bottles. And the interesting thing about PET is everybody thinks of highly recyclable when they think PET. Water bottles are. The rest of it we need to work on. We need more recycling of thermoforms or those clamshells, and we need more recycling of opaques. So anything with color in it. And so there's a lot of work to be done there, but PET is probably the most recognizable of the polymer types. Now we move on to polyethylene, probably the second most recognizable type of polymer. There are multiple different types of polyethylene. You've got low density, high density, linear low density, a lot of confusing things there. But really when you think this polymer type, High density, just think of detergent bottles, tubs, anything that's going to be made that needs some rigidity, some structure, and needs to be able to take impact. That's going to be a high density. Your low densities are going to be either in films or it's going to be in other applications where you don't need as much impact resistance. And then linear low is definitely going to be your films. And there's a bunch of different types of linear lows, which we don't necessarily need to get into, but just there's a bunch of different what they call copolymers. And the different copolymers are added into linear low to give it specific properties that'll make it useful, specific to films for the most part. And when you talk about films, with polyethylene specifically, most of the time you're adding these copolymers in to change the melt temperature of the film. So if it's a multi-layer film, you want the inside layer that's going to attach to the other that's going to melt together. You want that to be a different temperature than the outside layer because you don't want it all to melt together, because the outside layer probably is going to have printing on it and it's going to be a completely different material. Polyethylene, it's a simple process. You're taking ethylene that's coming out of what's called a cracker for the most part. You're going to steam crack it, which means just break it down. You're going to take a natural gas most of the time. It's going to break down into multiple different products, but the primary of which is going to be ethylene. That ethylene is then sent to a reactor through pipelines. It's in gas form. And then that is taken through the reactor. It's polymerized, and you make polyethylene. Depending on the different type of reactor you use, you're going to get the different type of material on the outside. And if you add different copolymers in, so metallocene, like I mentioned before, different things like that for the linear low, you're going to have a completely different material that comes out on the other side. And they're each purpose built for the application. So polyethylene is also very highly recycled when you look at high density polyethylene. So milk jugs, detergent bottles, things like that have a pretty high recycle rate compared to some of the other plastics, but not nearly as high as PET. Now on to polypropylene. Polypropylene is going to come out of the same process, and polypropylene is PP. I guess it's also helpful to actually tell you the acronyms as I'm going through this. So PP for polypropylene, PE for polyethylene, PET for polyethylene terephthalate. So PP, or polypropylene, is produced through the similar process as what polyethylene is made on. So the cracker, the primary output is going to be ethylene, but then you're also going to have smaller portions of other what they call derivatives or other products that are going to come out of there. And propylene is one of those derivatives. When you're using natural gas, you're going to get less derivatives than you do when you're using crude oil. So if you ever heard anybody say cracking heavy versus cracking light, you're cracking natural gas. You're going to have less propylene coming through that process. If you're cracking heavy, you're going to have 7 times more propylene coming out of that process. The reason why you're not seeing as much heavy cracking in the U.S. is natural gas has a better price point and better economics throughout the entire value chain than oil or crude oil or naphtha. So naphtha is off crude oil. So when you talk about propylene and polypropylene specifically, there's not as much propylene being produced in the U.S. as it used to be because of natural gas cracking versus a heavy or crude oil cracking. So they've made new production units called PDH units. And these units are, you'll maybe hear them referred to as on-purpose propylene. So they're out there trying to create propylene specific for its use rather than being a derivative that comes off of a steam cracker. So these units are up and down. The technology is getting better, but it's still a struggle. So polypropylene is by far the most volatile of all of the polymers in the US because of the nature of propylene being just a bit short in the US from a structural perspective, but even more so with the volatility of PDH units and ethylene crackers not making as much derivatives or propylene as they used to. So polypropylene is a very widely used product. It's the second most produced material, plastic material or polymer in the world behind polyethylene. Polypropylene has good heat resistance, good chemical resistance. It's used in a bunch of different applications, automotive, textiles. You can see it in clamshells as well. So thermoforms, and then you're going to also see polypropylene in automotive. And typically it would be filled with something. So you could see it with calcium carbonate or glass filled to give it some additional impact resistance. But polypropylene is not as highly recycled as polyethylene or PET. There's a lot of effort into expanding the recycling of polypropylene, but it still lags in many cases due to lack of end markets. Now on to the good stuff, polystyrene. So polystyrene can come in many forms. It's one of the oldest polymers in the world. It is easy to manufacture. It's easy to process. It's cheaper. It's lighter. There are a lot of different reasons to use polystyrene. Polystyrene is also under threat for NGO different reasons. There's a concern about styrene being toxic, which is not actually true when it's polymerized. There's concerns about microplastics from polystyrene versus others, which is also not true. So there's a lot of different things going on with polystyrene, which keeps me busy in my day job. So polystyrene PS, but depending on the form of polystyrene, it could be EPS or expandable polystyrene, what some people will call styrofoam, which is a misnomer. Should not be called styrofoam. Styrofoam is actually a trade name that's used for insulation material. So anytime you hear somebody saying styrofoam when talking about any kind of foam application of polystyrene, more than likely is misusing it. So expandable polystyrene, or EPS, is the true name of it. There's also XPS. XPS is going to be more like what you see in a Chick-fil-A cup. So EPS are going to be the little beads that are all mashed together to make it into one form. XPS is extruded polystyrene foam. And so when you tear it, it's not going to break into the little beads like it would if you were trying to break up an expandable polystyrene. So it's different. It's still foam, but it's a different type of foam. So then you've got polystyrene, EPS for expandable with, let's think, transport packaging. If you ever get a shipment of material to your house, if you get a washer, dryer, any kind of like appliance or anything like that that needs to be protected, it takes a ton of impact, a lot of heat resistance, and it's really great for thermal insulation because of the trapped air within the foamed product. So foam can be anywhere from 95% to 98% air, depending on the application. So it is a huge decrease in the amount of material that you use if you use foam polystyrene versus, let's say, cardboard or molded fiber, things like that. And those don't have nearly the impact resistance. So polystyrene is going to come in multiple different forms as well as formats. So the different forms, you're going to see a general purpose polystyrene. Sometimes people will refer to this as crystal, or GPPS, general purpose polystyrene, GPPS. That's going to be your clear thermoforms. You're going to see some cups that will be made out of general purpose polystyrene. There's a bunch of different applications. And then you've got high impact polystyrene. So that could be, that's also referred to as HIPS, HIPS. And that's going to have a rubber content in there to add impact resistance. So that's going to be in any kind of thermoformed application that needs impact resistance. It's also going to be in refrigerator liners, automotive. It's going to go into a lot of different applications that you wouldn't normally think of when you think of polystyrene. So polystyrene, it's made through the polymerization of styrene. So styrene is a naturally occurring material or a naturally occurring chemical that is also made synthetically through taking benzene and ethylene to make ethylbenzene, which then further processed to make styrene monomer. Styrene monomer is going to be a liquid. It's going to be very, very different than the other polymers that we've talked about so far, specifically polyethylene, polypropylene. So you're going to have liquid moving around the country in styrene. And then when it gets to a reactor, then it's polymerized. And then there is very low residual styrene in these products afterwards, specifically for food contact applications. So it's inert, it's safe to use, there's no concerns, it's FDA approved. The European Food Safety Group just recently came out again saying that it's not genotoxic, polystyrene that is, and it's safe for food contact. By far my favorite polymer. I've been buying it and now on the sales side of polystyrene for a long time and highly involved in advocacy for polystyrene in my day job. And polystyrene is a ton of fun for anybody that wants to learn more. I'm always available to talk about it. So other polymers, there's so many other polymers out there, but we'll just focus on a couple. Another of my favorite, ABS, so acrylonitrile butadiene styrene. It is a material that is high rigidity. It is used in automotive applications. It's also used in toys. It's used in some food applications and packaging applications, but not many. And it is recycled today through e-waste programs, and recycling for it is growing. And so that's also part of my day job. Spend a lot of time with ABS. Polyamide. So polyamide, otherwise known as nylon. So nylon can come in a lot of different forms. There's PA6, 66, 666. So it's just different types of nylon that are purpose-built for different applications. You've got just all sorts of other types of engineered plastics for high heat resistance. There's just so many different ones out there that I don't normally talk a lot about because they're not highly used, and it's not something that we're going to be talking a lot from a recycling perspective because there's just not as much of it out there. So it is not part of the 80% that I'm focused on. So the 80-20 rule. But there's a lot of it out there. You can find different things online if you're really interested in different engineered resins, but that's not going to be my primary focus. Plastics industry jargon. There's a lot of it. I'm not going to break down all of it, but we'll just get high level. So we've already talked polymers. We've already talked all the different types of polymers. But there's a thing called monomer. So a monomer, I mentioned earlier, was styrene monomer. That is the building blocks. Otherwise, sometimes people call it feedstock that will go into producing a polymer. So in styrene monomer, you polymerize that monomer and it becomes polystyrene, so polymerized. Thermoplastic. So a thermoplastic is a material that can be melted and remelted repeatedly. So most everything we've talked about so far, actually everything we've talked about so far is a thermoplastic. Polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, PET, ABS. All of these materials can be melted and remelted multiple times, otherwise known as recyclable. So that's a different argument than is it recycled? It is, can it be recycled? And the answer to that is yes. Any thermoplastic by nature can be recycled. Thermosets can also be recycled in some cases, but that's a little more difficult because once that material is melted and then sets, it's going to be locked in place. You can't heat it again and then make it over again. You've also got multiple different types of processes. You've got injection molding. So injection molding is, so think cutlery or other widgets or small parts that will be made. And the process heats the material. It forces it into a mold. That mold could be anywhere from 1 to hundreds in order to make different products. And then the material is forced into each of the cavities. It sets, and then it opens up. And then you've got all of these different parts. Blow molding, you're going to take a slug of material, you're going to melt it, you're going to force air through it, and then it's going to form into the mold. So think HDPE bottles, like we talked about earlier, detergent bottles. A lot of that is made through blow molding. Thermoforming, you take a sheet of the material, you heat it, you put it into a mold, and then that will form around the mold, and then it'll be cut. You've probably also seen something called vacuum molding, where it's very similar. It's just you pull the air out rather than force it onto a mold. And then people use the phrase extrusion. Extrusion is when you heat the material and you push it through a die, and you can make any kind of shape. Think Play-Doh when you're playing with Play-Doh when you're a kid. A bunch of different additives. You've got anti-stats, which reduces static buildup if you're packaging for any kind of, we'll call them appliances or computers, things like that. Anti-fog, it reduces exactly what it sounds like. It reduces fog in a window if you've got a hot product that's going into a bag, let's say, and there's a film on the bag, and you still want to be able to see through it. If you don't have anti-fog, that screen or the window will fog up and you won't be able to see through it. Antioxidants can be used to increase the life of a product. It reduces oxidation within the material so you can recycle it more. You got flame retardants, multiple different types of flame retardants. There's a lot of different things. Pigments, you can add colors, plasticizers, which will make it more flexible. There's so many different things that go into plastics. It's very difficult to give just a high-level overview, but online there's a ton of different resources that you can find. You can look up there's an additive dictionary, and I'll put it in the show notes today if anybody really wants to find these things online. But there's a ton of jargon. There's probably way more jargon than I'm not even thinking of right now because I just lived it for the last 12 years. So it's kind of hard for me to know what's jargon, what's not. But I think those are pretty high level. Now on to the fun stuff, recycling. So recycling has its own unique language, its own unique jargon, anywhere from facilities to talking about policy initiatives. There's just a lot of different things that are going on in recycling, and they all have their own acronym, and it gets very confusing. So we're going to take the next couple minutes here to walk through all of the different, at least jargon and acronyms that I'm aware of, and try to make sense of those for people. And if there's anything that I miss in this whole thing and you're like, man, why didn't you talk about this? Please put them in the comments. Make sure it's a part of a conversation, because I want this to exist as almost a place of people that can go to it. And if they got somebody new that's starting up and they want to learn about recycling or plastics, they can look at this. And the more complete we can make it, even in the comments, I think the better off everybody is. Where do you even begin with the jargon of the recycling industry? Well, I guess the easiest place to start is kind of what dictates how we can speak about the recycling industry. So the FTC Green Guides, Federal Trade Commission's Green Guides, are the law of the land. They're readily available online. You can read up on it. And anybody who is involved in marketing or sales or purchasing of recycled plastics or recycled anything for that matter should be up to date on what's in the green guides. It's really the only thing out there that dictates how our industry works from a sales perspective and what we can and cannot say. So if you're not up to date and you don't understand the green guides, that's a big problem. And I think everybody in the industry, that should be day one, read the green guides, understand what the ground rules are. Now, the green guides have been rumored to be updated for as long as I've been in this industry, at least like the last 8 years. Everybody's talking about how they're eventually going to get updated. They're going to get updated this year, and it just never happened. So as of right now, the most recent publishing, that is how we can stay on the right side of the law when it comes to recycled content. So within the green guides, there are very specific rules for how we can communicate about materials. So I want to talk about PCR versus PIR. PCR, post-consumer recycled, versus PIR, post-industrial recycled. Sometimes you will see that referred to as pre-consumer. So pre-consumer is the same thing as post-industrial, which is confusing because the acronyms for pre-consumer recycled is the same as post-consumer recycled. It's going to show up as PCR, which is really stupid. I don't know why we do that, but I still refer to post-industrial because I like the nomenclature there. I like the terminology better. I think it's more apt and accurate to discuss what it is we're talking about. So post-consumer, what is a post-consumer material? Post-consumer is anything that has reached the end of its useful life in the end application that it was created for. So think any kind of water bottle that went to your house and then you put it in the curbside recycling. It went to a recycling facility and then made its way back into the economy. That is not the end-all be-all of post-consumer recycling. Curbside is not the end-all be-all. It's very important that people understand that there are industrial or business-to-business applications that are considered post-consumer as well. So if it's a material, let's call it a stretch wrap, for example. If you have stretch wrap that is holding everything on a pallet together, and then that stretch wrap is collected at a distribution center once it's all taken off of a pallet, it's collected there, and then it's sent back to a recycling facility, and that's made into new products. That's post-consumer. The consumer in that case is the distribution center, and the end application was what it was created for, to hold that material on the pallet to move it across the country. So it has reached the end of its useful life at the end consumer, in this case, the distribution center, and that is post-consumer. Does not have to go to your house. Consumer does not mean you and I sitting at home. It means whoever is consuming that material in the application that it was designed for. Post-industrial is different. Post-industrial is plant scrap. Just think of from a resin manufacturer's perspective, you might be able to get away with calling wide spec or off-grade material as post-industrial. I wouldn't recommend that. I would say that that's even not necessarily post-industrial recycled. Think more if somebody's making a pipe at a plant. So if they're extruding a pipe and then they have to cut the end of it off, and that scrap at the end of it is then reground and then put into boxes and sold. That is post-industrial. I'm on the record multiple times saying that diversion from landfill is what matters to me. Whether or not it's post-industrial or post-consumer, I don't think that really matters. But there's the law of the land. The FTC says you have to look at these things differently. You have to market them differently. So that's what I'm going to do because that is the law. I'm going to stick to that. But philosophically, I think diverting material from a landfill, whether or not it reached the end of its useful life at the end consumer, or if it's skeleton scrap on a thermoform that typically wouldn't be able to be recycled by many people, but somebody finds a solution for it, I think that should be able to be looked at in the same way because that material is probably destined for a landfill today, but somebody figured out a way to collect it, recycle it, and put it back into the economy. That is a value add to the economy, to the circular economy, and that should be counted. It is not today. So that's a big one. So you got post-consumer, post-industrial. You'll hear that all the time whenever you're talking about recycled products. You will also hear MRF, MRF, Material Recovery Facility. So that is typically a municipal, sometimes they're privately held, but a lot of the time it is a municipal facility that is collecting all of your green or blue bin material from curbside pickup. So when you put all your recyclables into your curbside, the truck comes, and what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to go to a MRF, or a Material Recovery Facility. And then it goes through and it's scanned, it's optically sorted, and then you've got bunkers at the end of this MRF where all of the recycled materials are sorted and collected and baled. And then that is sold to either recyclers directly, if it's cardboard, or OCC is another one, old corrugated containers, so corrugate, cardboard. If you got bales of cardboard, that's more than likely going to go directly to a paper mill. If you've got a bale of PET, that's more than likely going to go directly to a PET manufacturer, somebody that's making water bottles or something like that. Then you've got other materials, we'll call it the end of line bale, sometimes referred to as 3 through 7 bale. So anywhere from polypropylene, polystyrene, polyamide, PVC, all of that is put into one big bale at the end, things that they're not specifically sorting for in some cases. In some cases, they have sortation for polystyrene or for polypropylene. It just depends on the MRF or the facility. When that everything gets baled into the one combined bale, that's more than likely sent to what's called a secondary sorting facility or a PERF, a plastic recycling facility. So that would take that material, then it would be sorted again, mine out all the material that they need or want out of that bale, and then so on and so forth. Kind of goes down the line. So once it is baled, that doesn't mean it's recycled. That just means that it is ready to be recycled. So somebody has to come in and buy that material. That is the end market. People will refer to it as end markets or responsible end markets. And really all that means is making sure that we're not dumping this stuff into Asia or some country that is going to end up throwing it into the environment. So it needs to make sure that it ends up in a place where it will be responsibly remanufactured into new materials. So that material could be anything at the end of the day. You could take polystyrene, make it back into picture frames, which happens quite often. It just needs to be a plastics to plastics application. So those are all the different facilities that are really involved. You've got the MRF, PERF, or a paper mill, a recycled paper mill that's going to take back all the paper. You've got a glass recycling facility. So there's always a next step. And that's where recycling can get difficult because you've got multiple steps. You've got logistics. You have costs throughout the life of this material. So even if you get it burden-free or cost-free, like $0 pickup, you still got freight to each of these locations. And that's where it adds up quickly. It quickly gets more expensive than virgin. So that's another thing, a key watch out for new buyers of recycled material. If you're talking post-consumer, that's gone through curbside, that's gone through all this different collection, the cost is going to be higher than virgin, specifically in plastics. There's just no way that you're going to be able to do this cheaper than virgin with the current setup and the way everything is. Maybe long term we can get there, but that's just not the case right now. And just all the extra handling and freight. So that, from a high level, is kind of what the recycling industry looks like. You've got a lot of different equipment. You've got optical sorters, which just takes pictures of the material as it runs along the conveyor belt. And then it could be air ejected to the next line. It could be manually picked by humans. It could be robotically picked by AI. There's a lot of different ways to get these materials separated. But for the most part, it's near infrared technology, which shoots a beam of light at the product. And then as it bounces back, the makeup of that material will show up differently within the computer, and it will be able to determine what the base material is for that product. Black can be difficult for near infrared. So that's why a lot of people say you can't recycle your blacks. There are companies out there that have made different color markers that you can add to your pigments that will be read by near infrared. But for the most part, black in the recycle stream is difficult because just the way that we're capitalized and set up in the system today. So there's a lot of different things that are going on here. We got PCR versus PIR. You got a MRF, you got a PERF, you got an end recycler, you got the end market. And then ultimately, you just want to make sure that's completely circular. When you're buying recycled material, it's very different than buying virgin material. Virgin material is going to be, there's a set line card of material that's available. I've got grade A that is melt flow of 5. It's got an ISOT of 2. Recycled content's not like that. There's going to be more of a variance. There's going to be a scale to these things. And the more open that you are to variance in your process, the more likely it is you're going to find a recycled content material that's going to work for you. Really, the big things that you need to look for are color. So is it natural? Is it white? Is it black? Is it mixed color? Mixed color is going to be the cheapest because it's all these different products blended together at the same spec that you can add colorant into to make a dark gray or black. So there's that. And then there's sometimes, depending on the product, you can have a range on ISOT if that's important in your application. But there's just so much to this discussion, and there's so much variance within the products, because if you run a facility and you're down that month, somebody's feed stream for recycled content is severely reduced, because if they're buying that material today and they're relying on that stream, and then you start to extrapolate that down to when you were looking to buy from material, it's always good to keep inventory on hand because you can never plan for these things. So just specifically if you work for a big brand or you work for a resin producer, it's always good to make sure that the people in the industry or in your business understand that recycled material is so different than everything else that they're buying. And it's important to understand that there is a lot of volatility, there's a lot of change, and when you find a good, consistent stream of material, it makes a ton of sense to lock it down. Policy initiatives in recycling. It all seems like a great idea. People always talk about how we need to incentivize inclusion of recycled content in the material because the markets are upside down. Yes, makes sense. We should have some sort of a system that incentivizes the use of PCR. And that really should be a capitalist incentive. Like, are people going to pay for it? And the difficulty that we continue to run into is end users and buyers are not, so far, willing to pay for these products. They don't want to pay more. So FPI, or the Food Packaging Institute, recently had an event in San Diego, which I attended and was great. And there was a lot of conversation back and forth about consumers really want sustainable products. But the more you dig into the numbers, the more you realize that the buyers of the brands and the people that are responsible for purchasing material to make packaging want the cheapest possible package because they want to combat inflation. But this has been an issue before inflation really became hot button. People don't want to pay for recycled content right now. Not all, but I'd say the great majority don't want to pay extra for recycled content. So we put into place things like EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. That has been highly successful in Europe, in Canada, and really what that set of regulations and laws do is increase the collection of recycling by making the brands pay into a system for each package that they sell into that state or regulatory body. So if it's a state or if it's a country, whatever, you pay into that fund, and then that fund is used to invest to create new recycling systems. So all of this sounds great, right? Problem is, people have to buy the recycled material at the end. Just because there's an EPR system does not mean it's going to be cheaper. This does not mean PCR is automatically going to become cheaper. And the other issue is there's a lack of recycling participation in the U.S. 43%, I've said this 1,000 times, I'm going to say it again. 43% of Americans who have access to curbside recycling participate every day. There's no amount of investments that you can put in for collection that are going to offset the lack of participation. That's problem one. We need to get people to participate. And then if we get the people to participate and we have the system in place to collect it, great. Still need the end market. Still need people to pay for it. And until we see where people are actually going to pay for it at scale, no amount of collection, sortation, investment, infrastructure, whatever, is going to create a circular economy. You need all of those pieces working together. It has to be holistic. If it's not holistic, it will not work. EPR will not work unless people are committed to buying the product, participating in the system, and actually investing the money where it needs to go. Those three things have to happen. So we can talk EPR till we're blue in the face, and we'll run into the same problems that we're running into today. So we've got EPR, like good EPR. Some people might get mad at me for saying good EPR because maybe there isn't good EPR to some people. But I think we'll call it realistic and feasible EPR. Colorado, Oregon to some extent. Minnesota remains to be seen. It's kind of up in the air still. And then you've got unfeasible EPR, California SB 54. That's not even EPR. That's EPR, bans, food packaging. So it's a packaging regulation system with EPR elements within it. As evidenced by the fact that Governor Newsom has told them to go back to the drawing board because it's going to cost too much. And I think people are starting to realize that none of their packaging is going to be acceptable come 2028 when the legislation, or the next round of rates and dates hit. Because paper bags, thin gauge paper, not recycled at 25% or 30% or whatever the target is. I think it's 30%. Really, the only products that are EPS transport packaging, bottles, maybe HDPE blow molded bottles. So PET bottles was the other. And then old corrugated container. Are you going to make every single package out of PET, HDPE, EPS transport packaging, and cardboard? There's just so much more that goes into running an economy and packaging that's just not going to work. Stretch wrap is going to be banned because stretch wrap's not recycled at 30%. It's just there was no thought that went into this. The idea is right. We want to incentivize 30% recycle rates. We want people to recycle more. We want it to become circular. But you can't just across the board say 30% because none of that was based on any kind of study that was done. Nobody actually looked to see, and as evidenced by the fact that the regulations aren't even set. And when in my day job, we went through and tried to figure out what recycle rates were for some products, Cal Recycle, who runs this, don't even have a system in place for how to even count this, or what's your denominator or what's your numerator. They don't know what they're doing right now. And I applaud Californians for trying to be aggressive and trying to make significant step changes. But constantly when that state does things like that, you have a bunch of unintended consequences. There's not a lot of thought that goes beyond, hey, we want to make a huge change here. We want to decrease plastic in the environment. Let's put it in a bag ban. Okay, so now we have to use a 40 mil bag instead of the really thin gauge bags. And then those aren't going to get recycled. And now we're in the same boat. Okay, well, let's just ban bags altogether. Seems like the next logical step. Problem is, the bags you're going to replace them with, these reusable bags, whether they're made out of woven polypropylene or let's call it cotton. How many times do people forget to take those things to the grocery store? How many unused bags? I don't even live in a state that has a bag ban. And I've got like 50 of those reusable bags in my closet. It's ridiculous. It just, human behavior cannot be changed by these kind of laws. And we need to make sure that these laws are feasible and reasonable before we implement them. And until we do that, these things are going to be a problem. So I'm off my soapbox now, and we're back to what do these things actually mean? What do these acronyms mean? So EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. Like we said, it's just a law that will create the infrastructure for more recycling. In theory, great. Whether or not it's feasible and whether or not it's truly going to make the impact, that's up in the air. I think we're solving the wrong side of the equation right now. We need to solve for the end markets and the participation before we can solve for the infrastructure. Just my opinion. Would love to hear in the comments if you disagree. I'd like to have a conversation about this as well. So that's one of the big ones. Policy initiatives. The big thing to pay attention to is EPR. I will talk about EPR a lot on this show, so it's important to know that that's extended producer responsibility, and it's there to increase infrastructure for recycling, which in theory is a great thing. So I don't know if any of this was helpful. I feel like it was helpful for me to put my thoughts together and kind of walk through and make sure that when I'm doing these things going forward, I am less reliant on the acronym and I'm more focused on explaining what it is I'm saying, which can't promise that I'm going to be great at right away, but I'm going to try. But hopefully this is helpful to everybody. If not, if there's other things that you want to know, if there's other things you want to see, like I said, put it in the comments. Let's have a conversation about it. Maybe we can make this an iterative process where I update this on some sort of quarterly, maybe annual basis to make sure that it's the most up-to-date that we can possibly get it. But thanks for checking it out. Thanks for following along. This is the Redefining Plastics Podcast. My name's Justin Riney, and everybody have a great day. If you want to learn more about the plastics industry, recycling, check out these other videos. Please like and subscribe.